Good evening to those of you in Israel. Good afternoon to those of you in the United States or elsewhere in the world. Thank you for joining us for part 3 of this series on understanding the contemporary Middle East. It's good to see many participants that have joined us for already for part 1 and part 2, and also some new faces as well. Those of you who have not seen either part 1 or part 2, you can email me, paulg@begincentre.org.il, and I can send you recordings of them. We have part 1 already up on YouTube, and part 2 we should have up by tomorrow. Okay, I'll just, for newcomers, I'll just briefly explain what's going to happen. I'm going to introduce our speaker, Dr. Menahem Merhavy. He's going to give a presentation, and you can ask questions by writing them into the chat box at the bottom of the screen, and I will read them out to him, and he will give us the benefit of his wisdom in answering them. So, without further ado, I'm going to pass you over to Dr. Menahem Merhavy, a fellow at the Harry S. Truman Institute for the Advancement of Peace at Hebrew University, and he's going to talk about the events of 2011, the famous Arab Spring.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Paul. I'm not in my natural habitat. That's why those of you who remember the background, it's a little different. Anyway, I'm very glad to be here again for the 3rd time, and today we'll talk about the Arab Spring. So I'm sure many of you would hope or would expect me to start in 2011 or so, but I'm going to take you back because I'm a historian. I'm going to take you further back because the events of 2010 didn't start really in 2010. 10 years ago, they really started somewhere in the late 1960s, believe it or not. And the reason I start there is because a lot of the things we've seen in the last 10 years in the Middle East have the roots actually in the late 1960s, or to be more precise, in the watershed moment of Arab history in the Middle East, and that is the 67 war. The Israelis know as the Six-Day War, Arabs know as Harb al-Ziran, or the War of June. And I start there because a lot of the criticism we've seen erupting to the surface in 2010 really started in writings, sometimes secret writings or things that were clandestinely distributed in the Arab world post that war of 67. And why is that? Because the 67 war came at the peak of the Nasserite years, the years of Gamal Abdul Nasser of Egypt, who was, I would not exaggerate if I said he was half a god in the Arab world until that moment. And Nasser and Nasserism, okay, and the image of this person and the feeling that he was very close to being invincible, he could almost do anything in the region and beyond if he wanted, that shattered to pieces in a matter of, I would not even say 6 days, a matter of 24 hours really, the first day or so of the war. And when Arab critics and Arab authors, thinkers, politicians, or people who would become politicians later on, looked at that war and reflected on it, they came to 2 very different kinds of criticism at the Arab world at large, the political sphere of the Arab world at large, due to that war. Okay, and these actually branches out to 2 kinds of criticism. One was a religious one, that is the Islamist movements. Okay, that you might be surprised, some of them at least were actually pretty glad to see that Israeli victory, because that was the, that one proof they were looking for, that Nasserism, that secular nationalism should be thrown to the garbage. Really. So that was one stream of criticism at the Arab politics. And the other one was, well, the one you would more expect, and the one that came out, again, more to the streets in 2010, and that was the secular or nationalist or secular brands of criticism at the Arab system. In other words, When Arabs looked at 67 and the Israeli stunning success in that war, they came to two different kinds of conclusions, or different people obviously came to two different kinds of conclusions. One was the Israelis were so good because they're so religious, because they're so cling on to their faith and they don't give up. You know, that famous photograph of the paratroops by the Western Wall, for example. Okay, that, you know, even people who thought they were not religious, deep down they really were. Okay, and that is something that some Arab critics didn't miss, especially the Islamist ones. And the other kind of criticism was, well, we want to know why the Israelis are so powerful. That is because, because they have a democracy, because they have free speech, and there's accountability of politicians, et cetera, et cetera. Okay? So as much as it doesn't look that simple from, from here, that is how Arab critics looked at the scene. Okay, I will take you now to a couple of texts that will help me show you what I've just mentioned, and to try to analyze it a little bit more. 1 second, there we are. Yes. So here's a text that exemplifies this. And was all that intoxication, delirium, all that here is Nasserism. Again, Nasser, that feeling that the Arabs can do anything. That is really the feeling Nasser gave a lot of Arabs in the region when in his times of greatness. That is mainly from 54 to 67. Perhaps, but I do not envy those who were not carried away by the exquisite dream. The sleep could not last long in any case. The inexorable Macbeth of real life had already raised his hand to murder sleep. Okay, it's a very literary piece by one Arab author where he talks about the delirium that Nasserism really was, or the people, the fact that people actually woke up from from that stupor that Nasserism gave Arabs, that feeling that they were invincible. I just want to show you a few more lines from a different text, again, by an Arab critic post-67. The Imam came forward repeating that we lost because we deviated from morality. The opposition leader insisted that we lost because the men in power monopolized total power. The engineer came forward asking for new machines and new factories, all found in the enemy what justified their argument. The theologian found justification in the theocratic orientation of our enemy, the politician in the fact that our enemy had a parliament. The engineer emphasized the abundance of the enemy's technical tools. Only few were able to observe that the religious faith of the enemy, his democracy, his technology were all useful instruments, but that the principal factor was the enemy's social organization, his sense of individual freedom, his lack of subjugation, despite all appearances to any form of finalism or absolutism. Okay? And that kind of criticism is developed further on, actually, with years, and it developed more with other developments in the Arab world. First and foremost, I would mention two major developments in the course of the 70s and 80s that brought more and more Arabs, especially another generation, post-Nasser generation, I would call them, to rethink the old truths of their parents, the old truths being that the Arabs are united or should be united, okay, they should strive to be united, and that such unity would, will solve the problems of the region, first and foremost the problem of, Palestine, us. The two developments I have in mind are, one is the Lebanese civil war that broke out in 75, and that war that tore Lebanon apart, really, to pieces, and was a terrible, terrible ordeal for Lebanese and for other Arabs, because Lebanon, just like in our days, Lebanon was a place where many Arab countries and also some other players in the region and beyond saw it as kind of a backyard to play in. And that Lebanese civil war and the fact that, not just Arabs fighting Arabs, that had been done before, but even people from the same country, the whole country seemed to implode, really, with sectarianism. That was something that, for those who maybe, let's say, did not have enough proof that Arab unity is a dream in 67 or 73. 75 was should have been the latest. They should have realized that. And the other development was actually, it has to do with the Lebanese war in a way, and that is the Israeli peace with Egypt that was signed in 79, 80, and 81 when it was finalized. And it happened so that the last agreement and the pullout from the Sinai by Israel happened almost simultaneously with Israel's invasion of Lebanon as part of that war in a way. I will not go into the Lebanese, quagmire here in depth, but just to realize that Israel was invading one Arab country to its north while signing a peace agreement or finalizing its peace agreement with another one in the south and to its south. And that's something that many Arabs could not miss. And I'm mentioning all of these points, the hard realization of post-67 turning into the Lebanese civil war and Israel's peace with Egypt, because all of those, among others, of course, other reasons, have brought more and more Arabs to question, to, as they like to say in America today, to problematize a lot of ancient truths, if you like, old truths of the Arab political system. I will mention a theoretician now who, in a way, the Lebanese civil war, more than any other moment, made him develop the theory that he called neo-patriarchy. His name was Hisham Sharabi. He was a Palestinian originally. He was from Jaffa, but he lived most of his life in Lebanon. And he wrote, in the late 1980s, he wrote a book called Neo-Patriarchy. And he starts the book in the horrifying, incident of 4 men sitting in a car in Lebanon on, road somewhere. He doesn't mention where, it doesn't really matter. And then they come to a roadblock and, a guard pulling out a gun tells them to utter, to pronounce a certain word. And by the way they pronounce the word, they're all shot to death on that spot. And that is the kind of situations you had in Lebanon during the war, because the way they pronounce words would tell who they are, where they're from. In other words, what sect they belong to, whether they're Christian, Sunni Muslims, or others, or Palestinians for that matter. And it could be the one sect against the other, doesn't matter who the sect is. He says this, this moment I freeze now, these men in the car and the person shooting them, that is what I call neo-patriarchy. In other words, we have a so-called, ostensibly, a modern state system in the Arab world, but in essence, or in social reality, we still run a bunch of tribes, really. Okay, he doesn't say it in these words, this is my words, but this is pretty much his message. It's very critical at the Arab society. It's not just Arab politicians, it goes way deeper than that. It's Arab society and the way and the intrinsic, I would say, connections within it. What decides, who people are loyal to. So Hisham Sharabi and the other events I've mentioned, it's a good way to start to think about how all of a sudden, so to speak, in 2010, people took to the streets. Of course, there was a spark, but a spark is that incident that starts, the fire. But the spark is quite random. It could be anything. And we often have sparks that don't start anything. They're not really sparks, just incidents, personal tragedies of people who, for example, collide with the powers that be. Okay, just like that Tunisian guy who started, who torched himself, who did self-immolation in Tunisia, and that started the Arab Spring. But, to say that he started the Arab Spring is pretty much like saying that World War I started because of an assassination in Sarajevo. I mean, you can look at it that way, but it's just a spark. You understand there's a whole system behind it that really made that specific event to be so significant. Okay, and I've started with all these problematics of the Arab state system, okay, because this problematic will actually lead us into the Arab Spring and further down the road to what became of the Arab state system, or some of those Arab states at least, after those events, after those series of events, which is often considered to be something between 2010 to 2013. In some places, to 2015. It depends on which country we're talking about. And of course, we need to ask ourselves, besides the events, that we'll mention some of them very quickly, is, okay, so has that really changed the system, or has that really changed society? Okay, we often, when we teach history to students, we tell them, what's the difference between a revolution and a coup d'etat? A coup d'etat is basically one ruler replacing the other, but the system really doesn't change, while a revolution is where the whole system, the whole raison d'etre of the state changes. So I'll try to apply this kind of, little rough definition to the Arab Spring and ask, well, has anything really substantial changed in the Arab state system? Okay, so it depends on two things. One is which country you focus on, and the other is what do you mean by significant, substantial difference. Okay, so I'll take the screen once more and take you to a little tour in the Arab world now, and to try to judge that. And then I'll take you to some other texts that I found interesting of Arab authors, and we'll see, again, some of those changes through a very different kind of knowledge or material. And I'll show you through humor, for example, what can we learn about the Arab state system and what has changed, at least in some countries. So it all starts here, where this is Mohamed Bouazizi, executes self-immolation in 2010. He was a fruit vendor, and he was picked on by the authorities in his town, and eventually, he lost all hope. He had no income, and of course, again, that erupted the wave of riots. And Tunisia is, relatively speaking, a small country. It's about 10, 11 million people. Okay, it's not the worst dictatorship the Arab world has seen, for sure. Compared to Iraq, for example, or even Egypt, it was a little more lenient in terms of freedoms and rights. And yet, Zain al-Abidin bin Ali, who had been ruling there for more than 3 decades, at some point actually decided it was the wise thing to leave the country. And by the way, he's officially, you won't find where he is, but well, it's quite natural to think he's probably somewhere in Saudi Arabia. That would be the country to host somebody who found himself without a home in this kind of situation. If we move on to Libya, we have a very different case, because this is a perfect dictatorship in the sense, that they talk about it in political science. Gaddafi, who rose to power in the early 1970s, was known to be not just a madman. He was definitely that too, and there's more than one proof to that. But he was also one of the more esoteric, personalities in the Arab world, and also a ruthless ruler at the same time. Okay, for example, he wrote a book in the 1980s that he called it the Green Book, and he pretty much insinuated that it was some kind of his own version of the Quran. In other words, you don't really need the Quran if you have the book I wrote, the Green Book. It's like his version of Islam. Despite other really weird facts about this person, what is interesting is that he turned a country that was quite tribal, okay, into a viable dictatorship, but he did not turn it into a modern state. And besides a couple of cities in Libya, overall, Libya has remained, compared to other Arab countries, much less modern. Okay, and the fact is that he also did not create a viable Libyan, personality or nationalism of any kind. Libyan identity. It's hard to speak of any Libyan identity. Unlike Zain al-Abidin bin Ali, who did create that in Tunisia, or in other words, he actually used one that had already been in place when he rose to power. And that's a great difference. So one of the scales we would like to think about when we compare Arab countries in relation to the Arab Spring and other things as well is to what degree have they created, as much as it could be a disputed identity, all identities are disputed to that degree or another, to what degree is there such an identity? Can we speak of as some national identity, some kind of social cohesion in the country? And in Tunisia, it's pretty high. If I were to think of such a scale. In Tunisia, it would be high. In Libya, it would be very low, close to nothing. Okay, and what's interesting is that such moments, of revolution or an outside invasion, by the way, we'll talk about Iraq later, so we'll see if it could come from that. They're actually a litmus test to those kind of dictators. In other words, have they left anything behind, or is it just a lot of smoke and blood that's left behind after they leave? Is there any national success in creating nationalism in those countries? And again, Tunisia would be pretty high on the scale, and Libya would be low. Egypt is another example of a viable national entity, really, that that had, well, I don't want to call him a dictator, but he was not far from that, Hosni Mubarak. And after, years, he was in power since the assassination of Sadat in '81, and since that moment, he ruled Egypt until he was toppled, after the riots of Tahrir Square. But there's no question that in Egypt you have a national identity. There's a viable national cohesion, and you can see that actually during the Tahrir Square riots as well. At some point the military, after some violence for sure, was unwilling to open fire at the demonstrators. That shows you that there is, a viable national entity here. Besides that, once Morsi took power, down here on the right, okay, Mohamed Morsi, who became president in 2013 for a brief moment, really, it was just a few months, who's from the Muslim Brotherhood after free elections, you could see that Morsi had no intention of, bringing down the walls of Egypt or opening it up to, to one Muslim entity, as some expected, actually, a Muslim brother to do. Hamas of Gaza, for example, was very, they were very disappointed that Morsi didn't go in that way, because he remained Egyptian. As much as he wanted to change Egypt from within, he still remained, a staunch and very proud Egyptian. Okay? Abdul Fattah al-Sisi, who replaced him down here below, right here, down here on the left side, below Mubarak in his best days, al-Sisi, who, unlike his name, is a very, very tough guy. When he brought down Morsi and put him in prison, actually there's a death sentence hanging over Morsi's head now, officially at least. He actually returned everything to Mubarak's period, and even more than that. Okay, Mubarak, by the way, had a softening approach towards the opposition in the course of the 1980s and 1990s. Well, there was ups and downs there, but he was definitely more willing to open up the system to, for example, the Muslim Brotherhood. Members of the Brotherhood actually had seats in the parliament. Okay, Sisi would not have any of that now because of the lesson from Mubarak's era. But overall, you can say that Egypt has. It's not a wonder. It's not a mystery why Egypt remained intact, because we have this, again, viable kind of stateness, you can call, in Egypt. In other words, as much as Mubarak was not a democrat and Egypt was not a democracy, it did not just remain a state. Its stateness, I would say, did not only rely on Mubarak's, iron fist or the intelligence organizations. Okay, if we turn to Syria, we saw a long civil war after the eruption of riots and demonstrations. In Syria, matters actually came to a more, I would say, precarious situation because of involvement of other factors, other actually actors from the region and from without. In Syria, we had Assad and the rebels at the beginning, and then we had jihadis who came from Iraq and other places to help. And then we had Kurds, we had American very hesitant, I would say, involvement, and then Iran and Russia, and it became really a very complicated pot of many different actors in the region. I think I was not very surprised that Assad wasn't toppled, as much as it seemed like a fait accompli, let's say in 2014 or so, 13 or 14, and simply for the reason that because of the demographics of Syria, which is very different from Tunisia and Egypt. Again, here's another factor we need to bear in mind, and I'm kind of bringing it as we move along the region to add another factor to, you know, the social cohesion to some degree at least depends, of course, on demographics. And since Tunisia is pretty homogeneous, Libya is not so. Egypt again is quite homogeneous in terms of the population of ethnic groups, etc. Syria of Assad is quite heterogeneous. You know, you have Kurds, you have some Shiites, you have, it's true, it's largely Sunni Muslim, and yet you have the Alawites, there's some Druze who are quite important minorities in Syria. And just to bring that point home, why is it so critical, the demographics? So again, one of the reasons why I wasn't so surprised that Assad didn't fall was that I knew that he would fight to the last drop of blood, he and the Alawites. If it wasn't him, it would be someone else, because the Alawites knew, Alawites is that group he belongs to, it's a small offshoot of Shiite Islam. They knew that, you know, they have to fight to the last drop of blood, because otherwise they might be massacred to the last. And it was really what they call a zero-sum game in international relations. I mean, what one loses, the other benefits, and the other way around. And once the U.S. was hesitant about its role or about its position in that inner conflict in the country, and Russia seemed to be very adamant on whose side should win, then, you know, I thought at least in 2015 or so that actually, if anything is fait accompli, that Assad remains in power, unless something really, really dramatic is going to happen in that, again, in that greater scheme of things with Russia and the Americans. I turn now to Lebanon, okay? And again, without going into too many details about Lebanon, only, you know, Q&A will take us there. You know, the map you see here in the middle, that is the demographics of Lebanon, you know, where dominant, you know, ethnic or religious groups, sects, as they like to call them, you know, are in different parts of the country. So that shows you how, you know, what a mosaic we're speaking about. And something about Hezbollah and its role in both Syria and in Lebanon during the Arab Spring. So Lebanon didn't really see the Arab Spring as Arab Spring. What you had in Lebanon, and actually you still see it in ongoing waves till now, is, well, lack of satisfaction with the government, or the lack thereof, really, of the country, the mismanagement of the country. And that includes even the very recent events at the port, you know, of Lebanon. It's not so much a story of Hezbollah, you know, having all these explosives in the port. It's more likely to be just mismanagement, maybe some money that probably went under the table to some officials, etc., etc. Maybe somebody would also use some of it to make a bomb afterwards. But it's the big story is really the lack of accountability in the country. And again, that is part of the large story of our region, really, in a sense, in a nutshell, in Arab countries at least, the lack of accountability of politicians. And what's interesting is to see how Hezbollah, you know, that organization that became so famous because of terrorist attacks against Israel, some other Arab Western countries, its wide network in the region, etc., how that organization is really with its back to the wall today, you know, with the situation in Lebanon, because it is part of the government. And I will get back to that point later on when I kind of return to Tunisia after this big tour we take. And I'll say something about what happened to the opposition, and especially Islamist opposition, once it's in government. It's a very interesting process we have in varying degrees throughout the region, well, wherever that is possible. Okay, but overall, if you take Hezbollah that was created in the early 1980s, and we see the mismanagement of Lebanon, so Hezbollah started to become something like a state within a state in southern Lebanon, you know, where the Shiites are a predominant sect, some neighborhoods of Beirut as well. And what we have after the Arab Spring, actually, in 2015, for example, riots broke out in Lebanon because it's called the garbage riots. It started really because of piles of garbage that were not collected on the streets. Again, because of some mismanagement of the of utilities in the country. And Hezbollah, as much as it put its feet in the government, okay, it found itself more and more embroiled into the Lebanese political system. And it found itself, and this is very interesting, because until then, opposition organizations, at least in Lebanon, did not, did not need to really solve problems, but just to point at them. And now that they needed to do that, Hezbollah found itself in a very tight corner, as it still is now. Okay, and in Lebanon, we see it. I'll say something about that afterwards. Again, when I return to Tunisia, Jordan is another country that the Arab Spring put in a very tight corner. But this is something interesting. If you notice that the monarchies in the region, okay, broadly speaking, were much more, well, remained intact, and I would say survived the Arab Spring in a much better, well, place, if we talk about the old regimes at least, compared to the republics. Okay, and one of the reasons is that the monarchies in the region, and I mainly talk about Morocco, Jordan, and Saudi Arabia, they have developed over the years, I would say, a whole set of tools of how to deal with the opposition, rather than just hit it with a bat. And there's a whole give and take and a whole negotiation leeway that the monarchs have in the region into dealing with the opposition. And it's not just a question of money. If it was, Jordan would not be part of what I'm saying. Okay, because it's a poor country by definition. It has an ongoing, chronic lack of resources. Okay, from the day it was born, it was to some degree at least dependent on foreign aid. Okay, and yet the king's father, King Hussein, and King Abdullah today, or many years now, have developed a way of dealing with the opposition that does not only include, again, oppression. The republics, however, because of their history, because they all came to existence really with some kind of a coup, often a military coup, back in the 60s or 70s, their handling of the opposition was much more, oppressive, really, brutal. And then when things erupted, it also demanded more power on behalf of the opposition. And then, again, if there's a critical mass, then toppling of the regime. So again, I'm trying to see some kind of logic here in the sense that the monarchies have survived pretty well in this whole process of the opposition. Saudi Arabia has, again, of course, it saw the pressure of the Arab Spring come, but Saudi Arabia has two things that most countries in the region don't have. One is, well, the place you see here in the background, or actually two places, Mecca and Medina, the two holy cities, and the fact that the Hajj, every Muslim is supposed to go there at least once in their lifetime, hopefully more than that. That gives this monarchy some kind of an aura of holiness. And the fact that Islam really reigns supreme in Saudi Arabia much more than it does almost anywhere else on earth, including Iran, that is a fact that, well, plays to its, merit when it comes to legitimacy. It doesn't mean that it's, of course, not democratic or anything like that, and it doesn't mean it doesn't use oppression when it needs to. But the religious, magic wand, so to speak, is in its hands, at least to some degree. Okay, and at the same time, and this is the other important element of this country, is the fact that it has money, of course, helps a lot as well, because opposition can also be bought and not just oppressed. But what I was meaning is another factor is that Mohammed bin Salman, okay, the son of this person, King Fahd, he actually did bring some changes in order to, to prevent maybe the next Arab Spring in Saudi Arabia. Overall, demographics are not in favor of Saudi Arabia, okay? Not because of any specific sectarian strife, They have a Shiite population, but it's pretty small and it's pretty much under tight control. But because of poverty versus, well, huge wealth of narrowing down sector of society, so the social gaps have become close to being unbearable in Saudi Arabia. And that, if you ask me about anything about the future, that's going to be one of the major challenges of the region, or Saudi Arabia and you know, the region beyond that. I want to stop here for a second, this and just to take you to another form of criticism that I want to talk about. One of the things that show us that the Arab world has changed in so many ways in terms of its, you know, the approach, at least of many middle-class people, let's say, to politics and politicians is humor. And I want to use a short video with an English subtitles, don't worry about that, from Egypt by a comedian. His name is Bassem Youssef. He's sometimes known as the Egyptian Jon Stewart, if you're familiar with that American comedian, because first of all, he looks like him quite a lot. And they actually interviewed each other a couple of times after that. And also because he was the voice of ridicule at politicians and some social taboos as well in Egypt since the Arab Spring broke out. He's actually a doctor by profession. Just a couple of minutes with the Egyptian Jon Stewart, with Bassem Youssef, and I'll have some concluding remarks before I turn to Q&A. 1 second. Yes, I'll have it.
وسط اللي بيحصل في البلد ده وبرغم الضغوط اللي بتحصل على الاعلام لسه في امل ان الاعلاميين في مصر سواء اختلفت او اتفقت معهم هم يقفوا في السلطه يقاوموا اي ضغوط يردوا عننا بقوه.
المهندس خيرت الشاطر الكبير قوي. انا هسيب ده لباسم يوسف، انا مش هتكلم انا. باسم هو بقى ايه اولى بذلك.
ايه شغل العيال ده؟ يعني حد مسليه لوحدي؟ سيبيني خد الشرطه ليه؟ طب اقول ايه صحيح؟ ازاي اعلق الاحداث اللي بتحصل في البلد؟ في الاعلان الدستوري جاي الحقوق. في اعلان دستوري جاي ده حط لنا ماده المسموح للمذيع انه يشتم في الحلقه 3 شتيمات. 3 شتيمات قبيحه. 3 مرات بس. انا مختلف تماما مع استاذ محمود سعد. اللي بيقوله ده غير مقبول ابدا. يعني ايه 3 شتايم؟ يعني ايه 3 شتايم؟ 3 شتايم مش كفايه ابدا عشان توصل اللي بيحصل في البلد. بس هنحاول، لان اخيرا جت اللحظه اللي مستنيين فيها اهم حاجه في مصر. وسط اللي بيحصل في البلد ده.
So that was Bassem Youssef, and his show was very popular in Egypt, and he started really from a video in a room even less impressive than where I am, and with an amateur camera, etc. And he became a big star in Egypt, and he really made some politicians sweat. He made fun of the Muslim Brotherhood. That's the Khayrat al-Shatar that he mentions in the video. And that shows you there is some kind of subculture that to some degree even has become mainstream in Arab countries. It's not just Egypt. You have that in Lebanon. You have that even in Yemen. You have some very satirists who ridicule the politicians, or at least used to until the war made it almost impossible. So I want to just have a couple of concluding remarks before I turn to Q&A. And that is to say that as much as the Arab Spring was surprising in terms of its timing, it definitely was. Again, the spark is never something you can see coming ahead. overall, the slogan, the people want to bring down the government, which was the most popular one in many Arab countries, were not so surprising in the sense that they showed two things. One is that there's a new generation, actually 2 generations by now, sorry, of Arabs who were not willing to accept, the big lofty words of politicians while seeing their country being, managed in a ridiculous or inappropriate manner. That is one thing. And the second thing was that I would say 67 and the shattering of Arab unity and the big Arab causes of the 50s and 60s opened the road for way more, I would say, introspection of Arabs into their own political and social conditions. And the fact that this, the toppling of the Soviet Union or the crumbling down of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s, which was the last bastion in a way of some of the, I would say, the hardlinest Arab regimes in the region, added another layer of big doubt as to the old political truths of the Arab world. Okay, and all of that erupted onto the streets, often with violence, in 2010 and onwards. Okay, so I will stop here and want to see where you want to take it from here. Please.
Okay, thank you very much, Menahem, as usual. A wonderful presentation and educating us. So we had a couple of very specific questions about Egypt. Before I get to them, I wanted to ask a kind of general question, which struck me thinking about this topic and listening to you. So you have in the Middle East, right? We have these 3 non-Arab countries, right? In Israel, Turkey, and Iran. And then the rest of the Middle East is basically Arab, essentially. I mean, in terms of majority. Looking at it from the outside, the three non-Arab states have generally advanced and developed much better than many or most of the Arab states, right? In terms of like general sort of modernity, modern development, educational attainment, that kind of thing. At least that's my understanding. You'll correct me if I'm wrong. I'm wondering whether, is this to do with, and it's kind of strange because the Arabs are the majority, the vast majority in the region. You'd think they would sort of have the upper hand, and they've sort of been in so many ways the losers as a group, as a national or ethnic group, or however you want to phrase it. Is it to do with colonialism? Is it to do with what you talked about before, the failure of national identity in so many of these places, the sectarianism? How would you respond to that comparison between the Arab states and these 3 relatively successful non-Arab states in the region?
Well, I would want to say that it has to do with nationalism, the national cohesive element in all 3 countries. But again, it's tempting, but it's not necessarily true, because Egypt and Tunisia both have quite a strong one, and they're not the only ones. So it's not that. But overall, I would just like to kind of correct your question, because mostly Arab countries did not measure themselves versus Israel because of the conflict, maybe, but not versus Turkey or Iran. Okay, so they're not really on the same field competing. Arab countries, if anything, would compare themselves to each other, and even then, not necessarily so, because again, for example, Yemen or Tunisia are considered to be, well, unique cases. Not that there really are, but just a way of looking at it from for many Arabs. But then again, there is something in your question, because many Arab some politicians, mainly intellectuals, ask this question: why do we have such a bad standing? Syrians, for example, Syrians in opposition ask that. Hisham Sharabi, that I mentioned, asked that, etc. And again, what they have often concluded was exactly, it takes us back to that point, that the Arab countries, Arab societies, well, those of you that have not gone through thorough modernization, in other words, have remained tribal or sectarian to a large degree, have remained backward, okay, or have remained behind in terms of political progress, okay? I will just want to problematize that before I finish my answer, which is more of opening more questions than answering, really, is that it's not exactly true, because some of the countries, for example, that Israel has just signed, the recent agreement with, are very tribal in every sense of the word, and yet in many ways you can say they're the most advanced countries in the Arab world. So it doesn't, whatever formula you try to simply explain that away, it doesn't really work. So I will try to conclude with some kind of answer, and that is, if a country is both sectarian, okay, and has not created any substitute for national cohesion, okay, whether it's wealth or progress as really a raison d'etre of the state, then it is in a very serious problem. Okay, so it's not a 100% answer, but I hope it answered some of it.
Okay, thank you very much. So I want to put to you two different questions about Egypt.
Okay.
And you can answer them both at once. The first is, it seems that Egyptians like to refer to themselves as Arabs when it suits them, but always seem to revert back to referring to themselves as Egyptians with a distinct character in society when they see fit. Was this always the case, or a recent advent with the leadership of Morsi?
Okay.
Because you referred to Morsi in that regard. And the second question was in regard to the Egyptian John Stewart. One of our guests asked that they were surprised that there was an Egyptian satirist on television because they thought that freedom of speech was majorly suppressed in Egypt.
So I'm not sure. Sorry, what was the question here?
The question is, how could it, given what we're led to believe about Egyptian suppression of free speech, how could it be that you could have someone like that making fun of the government or whatever?
Okay. Yes. Okay. So I'll start with the first one: Arabs or Egyptians. So okay. So this really takes us back to the 50s and 60s, as I said. In Nasser's time, Egypt was supposedly the leader of the Arab world. Okay, but that really died with Nasser. Nasser, by the way, passed away in September 1970. And Nasserism died with Nasser. One might even argue it died in June '67. Nasserism, not the person, but the ideology. So from that moment on, Egypt really took, with Sadat in power onwards, it was really where Egypt decided that, well, it is part of the Arab world in terms of culture, but don't expect any political benefits from that. In other words, do not expect Egypt to be, the battlefield or to lie on the fence for other Arabs, be they Palestinians or others. Mubarak put it succinctly in 2000 when he said, if Hamas wants to fight Israel, let them fight Israel. Don't do it for my territory. No, not allow it. So that that was very blunt. So yes, they're Arabs by culture, but not by, well, politically it's almost empty of meaning, I would say. Coming to Jon Stewart, well, Bassem Youssef and satire. Well, a lot of things changed in 2010, and actually Bassem Youssef's best years. He lives in the States now, by the way, not in Egypt anymore. If that partly answers your question. His heyday was during that period of free elections, Morsi in power, and a little bit after that, but then he drifted away, because you're right, in Assisi's Egypt, you can't have such a satire, for example, on Assisi. You just can't do that. So it's better to laugh at at that time it was okay, but it was quite limited. He didn't want to end up in jail, I assume. Okay.
So we had one, I guess, with two questions. One is about, she asked about the future of the Arab Spring. I guess sort of where are the developments that took place then? Where are they going to lead us to? And the second question about Lebanon and the future of Lebanon and specifically Hezbollah's position in Lebanon.
Well, yes. So about the future. So there's more than one future. So Tunisia, which I kind of promised you and I didn't deliver. Tunisia, what happened in Tunisia, interestingly, is that They went to elections, well, pre-elections, and the Islamists had a major power. They could actually form the government, and they didn't need anyone in their coalition in terms of the number of seats in the parliament. And then the Islamists did something very interesting. When I say Islamists, it's called the Nada. It's the Renaissance movement, the Islamist movement. It's a sort of Muslim Brotherhood of Tunisia, if you like. What they did is they didn't want to have all the power in their hands. They actually wanted to share power. And that's very interesting. I speak at the Begin Center, so very few politicians would share power with others when they don't have to. And they decided to, because wisely enough, they thought that it would not be right to make Tunisia, Islamist again, but rather to share the power and responsibility over what's happening in the country. They understood that the challenges are great, and it's better to actually share the power, even though they could have done otherwise. In other words, that's one path of future, but it's unfortunately it's quite rare. Tunisia is really, it's some kind of a democracy, really, where the Islamists know how to share power with the other more secular, sectors of society. The other futures are two. One is Egypt, that is, well, back to square one, really, even half a step back from there. In other words, back to tight control. I don't want to call it authoritarianism, but it's not far from that. Okay, that's another path. In the Syrian case, it's back to that with a lot of smoke and blood. In Egypt, it's less so, but that's another path. Okay, and a third path is that of Saudi Arabia. Okay, and that is, well, soft reforms with some promise for more in the future, if you behave well, if you don't want to take too much too quickly and to change the whole system right away. In other words, it leaves you more room for for hope. So those are three kinds of futures I can or presents, really, futures from them that I can delineate. About Lebanon, what's going to happen in Lebanon? Well, I honestly don't know. But what I do see in Lebanon, which is kind of optimistic, two things. One is Hezbollah is weaker than ever. What Israel hasn't done to Hezbollah in 20 years, 10 years of war in Syria and riots at home has done to this organization. In other words, it's really in its worst days ever. It's it has rockets and all of that. It's true, but it's really with its back to the wall when it comes to its image in the Arab world, in Lebanon in particular, etc. It's part of that system that's so rotten and corrupt that the youth are taken to the streets. Even among the Shia, believe it or not, some Shiites also take to the streets and demonstrates against Hezbollah. It's very embarrassing to this organization. Who would have dreamed of that in 2000 or so? And the other thing is that I'm a little optimistic about is that the country is really holding together. In other words, as much as it's a mess, and it's true, it's in a terrible mess. It's financially, it's on the verge of bankruptcy. It wasn't announced yet. But at the same time, all these youth from different sects really are sick of the sectarian system that's ruling them. And they do it together to that degree or another. So I don't know if they'll succeed or not, but the fact that they demand it together is quite optimistic. It's something, again, Hisham Sharabi that I mentioned with neo-patriarchy, he's probably smiling in his grave, says, wow, something has really changed here.
Okay. Let's turn to Saudi Arabia. We have a question. What, in your view, or how, in your view, will the Saudis react to the peace deal or normalization agreement between Israel and the UAE?
Oh, I'm pretty sure they were notified of that. I'm pretty sure, and they're pretty happy with that. There's no, I don't doubt it. It's part of the anti-Iranian crescent that Israel is trying to build, or Saudis and some other Sunnis in the region against the Iranian the Iranian influence. So Saudi Arabia is part of that. For other reasons, it cannot come out to the open with its relations with Israel, but it's no secret that it has them. So yes, it's definitely on the same side here.
And do you think it could follow suit, or would they is it more difficult for the Saudis to be so?
It's more difficult for the Saudis. One is because their raison d'etre is much more religious, religiously devout, and that puts them in a very awkward situation because the clerics in Saudi Arabia are very powerful people. They don't rule the country, but they're very powerful, and I don't see a situation where the king would get the permission or fatwa that would make it possible. Okay, but even if he did, I'm not sure he would ask for one because, again, the fact that they rule over the two holiest cities, Mecca and Medina, and the fact that millions of Muslims, well, once Corona is over, will come back and visit those cities on an annual basis, that makes it very problematic for the Saudis to come out to the open. They do need Israel to go forward with the Palestinians in that way or another in order to, to make it official.
Right. Okay. Two questions which are sort of somewhat connected. One asks about whether the difference with the Gulf states is whether the question of how modern and developed they are. Is it because they're more homogenous, not multi-tribal? Is one question, and the other one, which is also relating, I guess, to the Gulf states and also other monarchies in the region. Does having a monarchy confer a certain stability to a country because of the continuity of leadership?
Well, about the first question, yes, it definitely has to do with homogeneity of the population and the fact that in some of those countries, really the indigenous population is very small, and it's a lot of foreign workers and others who work and do things in the country, but it's really small countries in terms of indigenous population, so it makes it much easier. So that's a broad question for these group of countries. The second question was what was about? Sorry, about their development.
About whether monarchy. What you talked about the
yes, about continuity of.
Yes. Is there something about the fact that they offer a continuity of leadership? Does that contribute to this?
I think so, or I would just add something to this kind of definition or answer. It's not just continuity, but it's continuity without, I would say, the facade of any Republican or meritocratic idea. In other words, yes, of course, you would expect the next king to be the one who has the merit. And yet the problem, if I go back to Egypt, okay, it was very much present and talked about in the last years of Mubarak's rule, that he was preparing his son, Gamal, to become the king. Well, the king, you see, was a Freudian slip here, to be the next president, right? And pundits in the Arab world said they made up a new word that they called it Jumlukiya. So it's like republic, but it's actually a monarchy. Remonarchy or something like that. If you
also Assad
or Assad of Egypt, right? So and they said, the whole and these very regimes were very much, again, their ideology was republics, the nation of the people, etc., etc. And it seemed like empty words, really. Gamal Mubarak was one of the most criticized, persona in the country in the years preceding the riots of 2010. So, and the monarchies have, their ideology is really too, that the family is in power, and so there's no pretense of anything else, and you shouldn't expect anything else in these countries. So, and as I said, it also has to do with maybe this kind of sense of security, gives them more leeway in terms of how to deal with the opposition, rather than just the iron fist that the republics tend to do. So it's that too.
Okay. I don't think we have any more questions. I have a last question for you.
Sure.
If we look at Egypt and what happened after the fall of Mubarak, the elections, the Muslim Brotherhood win, I wonder if it's something similar to what you talked about last week with Iran, where you were talking about how the one place where the Shah was not able, or chose not to, rather, sort of interfere with what was going on, was inside the mosques. So inside the mosques, there was a sort of, that's where people could get something that wasn't the state, that wasn't the oppressive state. And I'm wondering whether in Egypt and maybe other Arab countries as well, the Muslim Brotherhood and Islamists generally had an advantage over any other group within society, in that they were the one group that were able, during the period of autocratic rule, they were the one group that were able to get a different message across to their people. You know, there wasn't some, you know, liberal or socialist or other, you know, secular political message that was being distributed to the people during the decades of dictatorship. But the Islamists were able to do that through religion, through the religious.
Well, I will. Okay, to begin with, the Islamists are not, the Muslim Brotherhood are not the ones who started the Arab Spring, neither in Egypt nor anywhere else.
Right, but
they just joined on the wagon. But yes, but but then I get to the comparison with Iran, and it's very different.
Okay.
For one thing, mainly two major differences. One is Mubarak, and even Sadat before him, did not have any qualms about arresting Muslim brothers, throwing them to jail, executing them. They were much harsher than what the Shah was. By the way, because among other reasons, because he learned the lesson. The Shah, by the way, is buried in Cairo. I don't know if you're aware of that. The Shah, yeah, he died eventually died in Egypt. And Sadat and then Mubarak after him learned the lesson. You know, don't let these guys do whatever they do. Don't let them go free. And they definitely learned that lesson. And there have been a few hurdles, a few attempts on the life of Mubarak, for example, that, you know, made him very hard with the Islamists. But there's another thing that they did that the Shah never thought of doing, and that is to share power. Mubarak actually called the Muslim Brotherhood to, not as a movement actually, as individual, anyway, he found a way, but to let members of the Muslim Brotherhood participate in the elections. They had seats in the parliament, in Mubarak's parliament. So it's true they never had the majority, and they would never have done that. But the fact is they could actually voice their complaints and their, you know, their anger and criticism at the government. Well, to some degree at least, to a certain line. But in other words, he let more steam come out than the Shah did. And overall, that has to do with, again, with what I said about the monarchies. They let more steam come out, and then the whole thing doesn't explode once, one bright day.
Okay, thank you very much yet again, Menahem Merhavy, for that talk. We're going to be back next week for the final part of this series, where we're going to be looking at Israel and Israel's sort of place in the region. I want to just conclude by saying there were a few comments in the chat about recordings. I apologize that this part 2 recording is not yet up on YouTube. I'm led to believe it will be tomorrow. My email is in the chat box. If you scroll up, you'll see that I wrote my email down. You can email me, paulg@begincenter.org.il, and I will send you the recordings. Part 1 is already up on YouTube. By the way, if you go into YouTube and you just put in the search box, Begin Center, Islam or Iran or Middle East or Menahem Merhavy's name, then you should get the first lecture anyway, because most of the Begin Center recordings are in Hebrew. So if anything you write in English will give you a relatively small sample to choose from. So that's about the recordings. I hope to see you next week for the final part of the series. And thank you again, all of you, and thank you, Dr. Merhavy.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. Good night.